Here we are at the pre-Presbyterian gathering for the 862nd Assembly of Newcastle Presbytery. And fittingly so, we are welcoming David Staniunas, archivist of the Presbyterian Historical Society. Given that our Makemie churches are celebrating their 350th anniversaries, we thought it'd be fun to have David come down and share a little bit about our history as a presbytery. So you'll hear more from David as part of the meeting as well. But for now, here we go. A little sketches from Newcastle Presbytery. Love to hear it.
Hi, everybody. I couldn't really ask for a better introduction. I said earlier that this presentation is not one that I've done well ever. This is the first time. And it's a little bit like bringing coals to Newcastle. Because I come here and talk about Francis Makemie and Makemie land. So bear with me if it seems a little strange. I'm going to tell you just kind of like a series of vignettes from your history. It's not like a passage through history that is smooth or without ruptures. It's really just a series of vignettes. This is largely indebted to a book, James Lapin's Presbyterian Bones on Marble, written in 1977. The earliest Presbyterian worship services in what's now Castle Presbytery were held in what's now Somerset, Makemie, and Worcester counties. And the efflorescence really belongs to Makemie. Makemie's born about 1658 in County Donegal, Ireland. He was educated at the University of Glasgow and licensed by the Presbyterian Society. He spent time as a preacher in Barbados in 1680 and was called to the plantation Rehoboth on the Potomac River by the plantation's owner William Stevens in 1683. He married Naomi Anderson, who's the daughter of one of the largest landowners. And it's likely that this connection helped foster Makemie's career as a trader in Barbados. Ran a sloop, so effectively a merchant marine in his spare time. By about this point in the 1680s, any merchant sailing to Barbados is part of the sugar economy. They're bringing back sugar from the plantation where enslaved West Africans were. Barbados from about 1660 to 1710 was really like the jewel of the English. Its capital is among the three largest populations in the English Atlantic, alongside Boston and Port Royal, Jamaica. Sugar from Barbados in 1680 produced more value for the British Crown than all other exports from its colonies. Its wealth was entirely built on enslaved West Africans who outnumbered whites by about 3 to 1.
Keep talking.
I'm going to keep talking. The slide that I'm hoping to look at is the ruins of the plantation in St. Lucie, Barbados, and then the Makemie monument. So Makemie organized Rehoboth Presbyterian Church in 1683 and built a log structure for the congregation on his own land in 1706. We can move to the next. Sorry, this place.
It's all right.
The church is
Say again where that was? 1706.
on Makemie's own land. I think that's the academic. Come back later. I need corrections, obviously.
And talk as if you're talking to the very back.
Yeah, okay. The church in Snow Hill, Maryland, and Menokin Presbyterian Church also. Makemie is organized in 1783. The Redan PC in Potomac City in 1683, and the Pitts Creek Church, which started out as a vision to be Redan in 1735, was built to be strategically located right within walking distance of Virginia to serve the centers from Virginia's established. And on the left, you have Old Rehoboth, in the middle, Snow Hill, and on the right, Pitt Street. So Makemie obviously serves as the moderator of the very first presbytery. It did have a name, it's just called the Presbytery. It was only one. Its first meeting was held in Philadelphia sometime between June and December of 1706. We don't know the exact date, but the first page of the minute book for the presbytery is missing. It picks up at some point in December of 1706. That fall, Makemie takes her colleague John Hampton with him on an itineration to Boston. Makemie school really was like the whole East Coast prior period preaching in the Carolinas. They stopped, Makemie and Hampton, they stopped in New York, where both Makemie and Hampton preach. Makemie at somewhere in New York City and Hampton, Alabama. They're arrested by the colonial authority or Cornbury, who's governor of New York and New Jersey. It's worth remembering that worship, and this seems insane to us today. This is the power of the First Amendment, but worship and preaching were regulated in the law. They were governed by a succession of toleration, by Parliament, in Great Britain, which outlined protection for members of the Protestant or dissenting churches. Makemie, for example, was licensed by Castle Presbytery, Virginia in 1699 to preach in his own and at his dwelling house in Portland. Let's see, I missed the quote. Licensing Halifax Town and his dwelling house in Portland. Registered and reported to be the first place of his constant and ordinary preaching. Idea that Makemie and Hampton are arrested for being street preachers. They don't have regular and ordered forms of preaching. They are charged with being strolling preachers, spreading pernicious doctrines. Both men are arrested on the 23rd of January 1707. They're held in trial until the 11th of March.
Hold the microphone.
Do you want to be this close?
If you can hold it in front of your mouth, it'll be more even. If you can hold it with your hand.
Well, we can try.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
It was a request from here.
I got you. The men were maybe 3 months and then trial. At trial, Makemie used to life and in any event argued that the college moving to the college, that there's no establishment. Makemie also held his prosecution quoting his account written long after the fact of the trial. And it will be unaccountable to anyone to hear the Jews who openly blaspheme the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, disown the whole Christian community, and Quakers who disown the fundamental doctrines of the Christian and both established. Lutherans and all others tolerated the lordship's government, and only we, who are nearest to and lightest the Church of England from any to be hindered, that only in the government of England the truth for his Makemie's acquitted, but held responsible for court costs amounting to 83 pounds. His account of the trial was published in later in 1707. On the screen the page from that account. Arguably, the trial cases the Kennedy's death. Quoting William Henry's 1850 sketches of Virginia, at the next meeting of the Presbyterian, which took place in Philadelphia, May 1708, Mr. Makemie was not present, but the record states that he had complied with the order made in the previous requiring him to write to Scotland and file preachers. His absence from the Presbyterian may have had much to do with his death, according to Twitter. Before the next meeting, Mr. Makemie had gone to the General Assembly firstborn, who named a written. Just a little bit of reading into the 18th century published sort of really reveals how complicated the laws surrounding religious practice and order in the colonies, and how alien to us the idea of a parliament regulating religious exercise. The legacy of this ministries is really our own first amendment. The presbytery, what is the presbytery? The presbytery ensures that the word is preached regularly and well, ensures that ministers are enrolled and paid, and when necessary, they get removed. If you look at in the next slide, you can identify the responsibilities of the presbytery.
So what we're gonna do, sorry, is we're gonna take away the amplified mic and just use our mic. And if you can't hear, so you gotta talk all the way to the back. That's what we're gonna do.
This is not it.
You can do it, David. I have faith in you.
You can come to Philadelphia and read the minutes. We have the next slide is going to be probably a 1723 meeting.
Yep.
Yeah, that's about it. This is on the shelf in Philadelphia. We have the very first volume of Newcastle Presbyterian minutes. Goes from its organization until the New Side, Old Side schism. The minutes from the period of the Old Side, New Side schism are totally lost. And then the Presbytery picks back up again in 1758. You go through a series of trials and tribulations in this period. So again, what are the responsibilities of a presbytery? You find ministers for churches. You make sure churches pay them. There's a lot of stuff in the minutes regarding adequate remuneration for ministers. Folks get quoted Romans 4:4. Every once in a while, you remove ministers from service. What judicatory proceedings do, as like superficially dry as they is they tell us about the nature of Presbyterian society in the region, of the things people cared about, the things that rose to the level of being offenses. And we learn what public morality consists of. So on the screen is Presbytery's August 1723 meeting at White Clay Creek. The Presbytery begins by reminding the congregation first to pay their supply, the Reverend Lang. The Presbytery is probably passed a note or whispered down the lane. They're quickly informed of why the congregation has paid Lang. Quote, the Presbytery being informed that Mr. Lang hath been guilty of profaning the Lord's day by washing himself in a creek, and he confessing the same, the Presbytery, after having maturely considered the nature of the offense, do agree that Mr. Lang be now rebuked by the moderator, that he be suspended from preaching until our next Presbytery, that then his cause be considered when the Presbytery is more full. Continuing, the moderator, pursuant to the above order, having offered a rebuke to Mr. Lang, and his carriage, when rebuked, being very unsatisfactory, defensive to the Presbytery, do agree that Mr. Lang be deposed from pastoral office, but withal allowed liberty to apply to the Presbytery. So it's August.
Oh, my God.
It's August, and you're a minister, and you're preparing to preach, and you're likely wearing woolens. You're going to be in woolens for a couple of hours in front of people whose own emanations are going to be coming at you, and all you want to do is to be fresh for worship. You are caught skinny dipping in the creek, and you're removed from your office. The guy just wanted to cool off hot August. There are likelier, more heinous offenses reported in the Presbyterian, but that is one that gives us a sense of like really how very seriously people took observances. And this is true for, I mean, this is true everywhere. I once read a book of minutes, a little section of one book of minutes from church in upstate New York that was on the line of the Erie Canal. And they were chastising a member who violated the Sabbath. The person in question was the postmaster of the village, and a barge just happened to come in on Sunday with mail. Guy had no choice but to go and get the mail on Sunday. Is still disciplined by his congregation. Took this stuff very seriously. So do we have the next one? From 1741 to 1758, like I said, there were two Newcastle presbyteries. One reported to the newly formed Synod of Philadelphia, one reported to the newly formed Synod of New York, a product of what's now called the Old Side, New Side schism. which is really a dispute between less than a dozen men on either side. And it's recorded as a big doctrinal, as tantamount to like the split between the split of the church into the PCUS and the PCUSA, but it's a dozen dudes on each side. William Tennant began theological training for ministers on his own in a cabin at the Forts of the Chamonix in Bucks County, PA in 1727. And this is at a time when the only seminaries that produced ministers were either in New England or in Europe. In all, the kind of derisively named Log College graduated maybe 20 men and wound down with Tennant's death in 1745. We remember it as one of the legacies of the First Great Awakening. Prior to about 1730, I think it's fair to say that preaching was designed to be uncharismatic. A preacher would read a sermon from a pulpit, much as I'm doing, enunciating a doctrine or a lesson. In the 1730s and 40s, waves of touring evangelists swept the country, preaching outdoors or occupying otherwise occupied pulpits, and they preached with the intent to spark sudden conversion by their displays of enthusiasm. These displays of enthusiasm are caricatured here in this etching of the English evangelist George Whitefield, who's depicted dancing on top of the laps of hypocrisy and deceit.
Ooh.
Yes, hypocrisy and deceit. Woo. Spicy. In 1739, new Castle Presbytery moved to add extra scrutiny to Log College graduates, having them examined by the whole synod rather than just by a gathering of the presbytery. In 1741, a protest at synod, point there was only the one, was lodged against William's son Gilbert Tennant and like-minded friends of his, decrying their heterodox and anarchical principles, their preaching the terrors of the law in such a manner and dialect as has no precedent in the word of God, working on the passions and affections of weak minds as to cause them to cry out in a hideous manner, fall down in convulsion-like fits, and so on. A vote on the protest was taken. The new siders were in the minority, and they reformed into the Synod of New York. The old siders continued as the Synod of Philadelphia. The enthusiasm of the First Great Awakening waned, and by the 1750s, no one understood what all this was about. Matthew Wilson, who was clerk of the Presbytery of Lewis, at that point then split off from Newcastle, writes kind of like an opinion piece in the preface to the minutes of Lewis starting in 1758.
Lewis, Delaware.
Lewis, Delaware.
Was its own presbytery.
Yeah, it was its own. Their clerk says the disputes were not substantially doctrinal, but were about style and liberty. His conclusion, therefore, the causes were probably these: prejudices, passions, rancor, want of Christian charity, bigotry, pride, covetousness, self-seeking, tale-bearing, and evil surmising, together with the influence and other stratagems of Satan. We remember Log College and its graduates chiefly, I think, because William Tennant Jr. and a handful of other guys went on to organize the College of New Jersey, which we know as Princeton. Go Tigers. In our next slide, in the immediate antebellum period, Newcastle had been divided into three presbyteries. Newcastle, which mostly covered Pennsylvania churches, Wilmington, which mostly covered Delaware, and Lewis, which covered parts of Delaware and Maryland. None were friendly to the abolition of slavery. The Presbytery of Chillicothe in Ohio appealed to Newcastle in this period, 1740s-ish, to join it in supporting immediate abolition. Newcastle's clerk replied that immediate abolition was directly calculated most fearfully to increase the degradation and wretchedness of the slave, both physical and moral. The agitation of this question in our church courts and making it a test of church communion threatens widespread ruin of our church itself. Lewis Presbytery told its stated clerk in 1840 to take an abolitionist appeal that they had got from the Presbytery of Ripley, which must be Ohio, but I don't know. That should be a note there.
So Ripley, West Virginia.
Ripley, West Virginia. All right, we're going to do this over again. And they received an appeal from an abolitionist presbytery, and they instructed their clerk to enclose said letter in a sheet of paper and return it to the source whence it came, unopened. Wilmington Presbytery responded to the General Assembly's 1853 holding that slavers should be removed out of the church by discipline, by saying that the assembly had acted out of accord with the word of God and the practice of the founders of the Presbyterian Church in the United States. Well, at least the second half of that sentence is definitely true. All three presbyteries, as was common in mid-Atlantic states, were supportive of the colonization movement. Newcastle ordained 3 Black men, James Ralston Amos and his brother Thomas Henry Amos, who were both Lincoln grads, and a man named Armistead Miller in 1859 to serve as some of the earliest Black missionaries to Liberia. James Amos is an 1858 Lincoln grad. He spent 5 years in Liberia. In an 1861 letter sent to his mentor, John Miller Dickey, Amos wrote, "Our school is full. We have 24 boarders. The Sabbath school is very large. The people come to hear the word of God. Morning and evening prayers find many in attendance. We have access to many thousand heathens." During the Civil War, Wilmington Presbytery expressed itself as abundantly unionist, moving in 1862 to refuse membership to anyone whose loyalty to the government is not clearly ascertained. And as late as 1865, with the war ended, they demanded extra evidence of loyalty from one minister being transferred from the Presbytery of Winchester because it is lying mostly in Virginia, a state lately in rebellion. We're going to take an intermission. How are y'all doing? I'm coming to the 20th century, which is one where I'm much more.
I'm at Makemie in Snow Hill.
Okay.
And we had a request from somebody who was trying to trace their grandfather and the family lineage and so on from the late 19th century. And the only mention we found of the gentleman that they were asking about was a censure in our minutes of him as a slave. Which was really interesting, right?
That's
Because
extremely
Makemie was himself,
Yeah.
I mean, when he married this woman, you know, the number of slaves that he possessed upon his death that had to be willed to somebody, I mean, it was significant.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I know Naomi inherits 4 people. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, again, speaking of some of the darker moments in Presbytery's history, was the sermon delivered June 21st, 1903, a Sunday evening. That's the next one. I need the art. The art helps. Crowds gathered outside of Olivet Presbyterian Church in Wilmington to listen to Robert A. Elwood warm to his theme, "Should the murderer of Ellen Bishop be lynched?" On June 16th of that year, 17-year-old Ellen Bishop had been assaulted on a rural roadside near Price's Corner. She died of a neck wound the next day. Late on the 17th, a local Black farm worker, George White, was arrested for the murder. Police allegedly found a bloody knife in his possession. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack. Before 3,000 people gathered at 4th and Broome Streets, Elwood preached what's a cruel mockery of the constitutional rights of the accused, saying that by delaying White's trial until September, civil authorities were depriving the community and the accused of the satisfaction of a speedy trial. He then whipped the crowd into a frenzy, theatrically waving what was supposed to be a handful of bloody leaves taken from the scene, invoking the mythic predatory alterity of Black men. Who did this? Was it a wild beast loosed from its captors and found an easy prey? Was it an imp of hell taking vengeance on a defenseless human? No, but it was a man with the heart of a beast, with the desires of a fiend, who gave vent to the bestiality and executed this damn crime. The mob laid plans. They posted public invitations to the lynching to be held the next day. On that Monday, a group of men seized George White from out of the Wilmington workhouse, took him to Price's Corner, and burned him at the stake. Reportedly, members of the mob waited hours for the polls to cool before looting the corpse for human remains. Elwood was tried and convicted by Presbytery for preaching contrary to the known principles of Christianity and of directly endorsing and advocating lynching. He went unpunished. So, quoting from the Presbytery's minutes, but in consideration of the unusual and peculiarly distressing circumstances when said sermon was preached, and giving full weight to Reverend R.A. Elwood's declared purity of intention, the judicatory hereby most earnestly and affectionately counsels him to judiciousness of utterance at all times, places, and circumstances. There's much more about Robert Elwood on our website. Incredible piece of work. He did eventually get kicked out of Presbytery for continuing to utter non-judicious utterances when he went on to have a pretty peripatetic career in Kansas and in Atlantic City as well. I'm next hoping to begin to close by talking about memory and growth, the relationship between like circling back to where your roots are in order to like develop new branches. I think there's no separating the Presbytery from the social fabric that's around it. What I've been talking about sounds like a litany of schisms and abuses and violence, a body of ruptures. But what strikes me most about the Presbyterian tradition in particular, and the Presbytery as a coherent body of believers, it is, is that you have a kind of continuity despite those ruptures. What I see is actually a series of continuities. One of those is the way that this Presbytery returns and returns and returns to Francis Makemie as like a monument or a totem. It's a kind of figure to gather around to remind you who the Presbytery is. To honor Makemie on the 200th anniversary of his death, the Presbyterian Historical Society, I joined, built a monument to be placed on the Makemie lands in Makemie. The statue was unveiled during the May gathering of this Presbytery in 1908. PHS, my shop, arranged for a special train with the help of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Eastern Shores Line, the New York to Norfolk Railway, specifically to bring visitors down for the monument's unveiling. The train took 4 hours and left from Broad Street Station, which would have been like the northwest corner adjacent to City Hall, which was one of the largest passenger rail stations in the world at that point. The first half of the 20th century for this Presbytery is maybe best characterized as kind of a fallow period, and prior historians have kind of like written it off. The Delmarva, I think, as a place was dislocated from the booming industrial North and Midwest, and was subject to the consolidation of agriculture elsewhere, the series of economic crises that followed the Panic of 1873, and almost did not end until the First World War. You started mission churches among Italian and Polish immigrants, but there was very little church growth. In 1933, I mean, sensing this kind of like foulness, the Presbytery hosted public celebrations of the 250th anniversary of Makemie's arrival in the original churches, which included tours of the earliest churches. Fervor for their history led the Presbytery to overture the General Assembly to have my shop move the monument from Makemie Park to Old Rehoboth Church in Maryland, due to the inaccessibility of the present location and the fact that in recent years the monument has been mutilated. We did not do that. The more you learn, the more minutes you read, the more you learn how resolutions and overtures can simply be ignored. And people will flip away. They will walk back though. But just a couple more footnotes on the monument. We can flip to like the next one with the guy on a bicycle. Yes. This is my preferred road to travel for what it's worth. Like everything else in the 20th century history of my shop, now I get to talk about me instead of you. The root of the Makemie gravesite restoration monument building begins with our president, Henry C. McCook, He's a fascinating character. He's a Presbyterian preacher, a minister. He was a Freemason, an amateur entomologist. The Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly has a bunch of his watercolor sketchbooks. And he was like an amateur designer. He designed the city seal of Philadelphia. Fascinating dude. He started fundraising in 1906 with the aim of buying the whole farm in Accomack, where, at least according to his fundraising letters, the ashes of Francis Makemie were buried under stables. And he doesn't mince words. For all positively known, the filth of horses may overlie the tomb of him whom our great and wealthy church has been commemorating as the founder during this bicentennial year. Give now. He also compared the site of the grave to John, lamenting that the reformer's grave was unmarked, of course, ignoring that that was intentional, done out of humility and the need to not create like a cult of personality around Calvin. There is some fog in the records about how the property transfer went down. And this was interesting to me, and hopefully interesting to you. Initially unwilling to break up his parcel, the guy who owned the land at the time, a farmer named Emerson Polk, eventually sold most of the farm to his neighbor J.S. Cullen for $3,000, and he sold 3 acres to PHS for $5. McCook had raised $6,000, and there is, in the interstices of the notes that we have, you can get really close to an implication that we used J.S. Cullen as like a straw buyer to kind of affect the transfer. But it's not set in stone. Basically $3,000 for the whole farm, another $3,000 to build a granite monument. Again, I mean, even late into the 20th century, I think part of the function of the monument is that it's a place that the Presbytery returns to kind of like renew itself at the root. You did this in the wake of significant upheaval in the church in the late 60s and early 70s, especially following UPC-USA support for the legal defense of Angela Davis. Following kind of this period of tumult, in 1971, the Presbytery comes back and starts a task force to move the Makemie Monument once again. It was eventually moved in 1984 after it was vandalized yet again, just as it had been vandalized in the 30s. That experience catalyzed action at the 1989 Assembly, itself another bicentennial, the bicentennial of the Full Assembly, which called on Presbyterians to lend support to the Francis Makemie Society. PHS at that point, my shop, once again, leapt into the breach and started a short-lived Francis Makemie Award for the best piece of historical writing in our journal. We still have a small fund for the maintenance of the monument, and we have worked recently with the Francis Makemie Society to make sure that the site is maintained. And this is all news to me. I had no idea that technically we own 3 acres. Unreal. We've learned so much. So again, we're coming blessedly to the end. I think so. The end of the 20th century, with the suburbanization of much of Maryland and Delaware in the 1950s, and with the merger of UPCNA and PCUSA in 1958, the mid-century becomes possibly the fastest period of church growth in Newcastle Presbytery. I think that's probably true with Presbyterianism writ large. Like many other presbyteries, Newcastle begins the late 40s and 50s developing new church plants in the suburbs, and over the late 50s and 60s adds city church development on top of suburban expansion. Spiritual growth, I think, was evident in your pronouncements of the 1950s and 60s. In 1951, again, I mean, recollecting that this was a presbytery that was, began adamantly against abolition of slavery. In 1951, Presbytery heard from one elder who spoke of the danger of ministers being used by the communists in support of deceptive peace movements. Responding to the beginnings of massive resistance against Brown v. Board and state desegregation, in 1954, the Presbytery called on all of its people to refrain from encouraging or participating in any school strike or boycott or other like reprehensible conduct to uphold and defend the processes of law and order. What I love is the appeal to the law in the pursuit of justice. I think the appeal to law and order in pursuit of justice is extremely critical. In 1961, the Presbytery issued its support for fair accommodations bills in Delaware and Maryland. So there seemed to be like a pivot from the McCarthyite early 50s, where all of desegregation was part of a communist plot, over to having like real humane social witness Presbytery by the 60s. Among the more humane moments in the last 50 years or so, in 1971, Roberta Kinney was ordained. This gave the Presbytery its first ordained married couple. And in 2015, on the screen, Holly and Casey Clark Porter were ordained by Newcastle, the first lesbian couple ordained in the Presbyterian Church. Okay, so editorial content incoming. Gosh, as if it hasn't been already all day. I think this Presbytery and the church writ large may feel like you're a far cry from the church of the 1680s. But like everywhere else, I think it's interesting to observe continuities in the face of historic ruptures. I was talking with a minister the other day who had a useful frame of reference for denominational history, the psychodrama between Scottish and Ulster Scots colonizers on the one hand versus English colonizers. The English in the Atlantic colonies were largely the landowning class. Dissenter Protestants were largely the managerial. They were farm and plantation foremen. They were the men who had the whips. They were not the people counting the coins at the end of the day. For the dissenters, getting ahead in society meant getting educated, getting accredited in a professional field. And ordered ministry was one of those paths to social upward. So the pitched battles in your minutes about making sure ministers were paid, fighting over who could be a member of Presbytery, which schools were legitimate, and in some sense, like reflects the psychodrama and the need for like, it reflects like the class struggle effectively between Scottish and Ulster Scots ministers in the Church of England. And so today, a majority white professional managerial church continues to struggle with who can undertake ordered ministry. I think that's a continuity with this. The church, in places called to a new abolition movement against prisons and police, struggles to understand that call as something necessary and immediate. And the church still gathers in regular meetings to organize itself for the cause of Christ. It sounds like boilerplate Presbyterian, but maintaining an organization is hard. It's hard to move people into shape. It's hard to keep continuity of business at any state, from like a neighborhood co-op to like a massive political organization. And your Presbytery has actually done that for 300 years. And my only message to you is well done. Thanks.
Thank you.
What else is slow? Sorry about the microphone problems. I'd be really delighted to answer any questions that anybody had or field comments, receive criticism. I'm sure there's stuff that I got wrong.
We're Presbyterian.
So
Smart cookies. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious if the Historical Society had any kind of written materials that be used in church newsletters.
Absolutely.
And when
So the
people-
question, the question from the audience for folks on Zoom is if PHS puts out any written material for use in church newsletters. Absolutely. So we put out a bulletin insert for Reformation Sunday. We also put out a bulletin insert for Heritage Sunday. I have some propaganda down the corner that you can take with you. And the lion's share of our publishing happens online on our blog. So that is history.peaceUSA.org. And if you just write to us and say, I want to drop this in the newsletter, we're going to say, yes, please. Yeah. Yes, please.
So are you involved in, isn't there a fall event at the Makemie Monument? Isn't there like a celebration or something?
The question from the crowd is, isn't there a, do you know something about the fall event?
There is. It's second, third, it's the picnic down there,
October.
the Makemie Society. I don't, that's all because I know this time that Dawson would be a better place.
Okay.
I know that they sent it back.
Okay, so for folks on Zoom, there is going to be a celebration at the Makemie Monument, October 22nd, 23rd, that weekend. Details, I think, sound like they're forthcoming, and Friends of Francis Makemie, the Francis Makemie Society, excuse me, is the organizer there. It's really the most remarkable thing about doing any kind of research into your Presbyterian's history, was really discovering the deep connections, bonds, and literal real estate bonds that my institution has with the Del Mar. It's been like really remarkable. All right, seeing nothing further. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed. Well done.
Thank you.